Well, I did say that I would like to start as it will form part of our Mandela University archive. So good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. It feels like afternoon because we're not all up at 5 in the morning, 4 in the morning, checking American results. So welcome to this. We have our own problems, never mind the Americans, they can solve themselves. So I think we'll get going. This is the final one in our series, the partnership between CANRAD, the Portfolio for Engagement at the University, and the Department of History and Political Studies, to put our living archives at the center of our discussion. And in this case, Professor Raymond Suttner agreed kindly to help us to find this way of engaging outside of the university classroom in a way that really gets deep into our history through people that lived through these moments. And remember, we are hoping that if this works well for us, we're going to really, over time, create an archive of other people who will speak to us. And part of our methodology has been to get a younger person to engage with Professor Suttner in this Living History series. And our discussant today will be Mr. Asemahle, who is an MA student in politics, as well as the Deputy President of the SRC, if I'm correct. So welcome, everybody. We're going to go straight into it. Today's topic, our final topic, is the ANC in history and in government. I look forward to your contribution, Raymond and Asemahle. You can go ahead.
Thank you. I am paying attention to the history because I think there is a sense in which the ANC appears to have become naturalized as the major force in representing oppressed people in South Africa. And in fact, if you look at the long history of the ANC, for many, many of those years, it was not that. It was never hegemonic until the 1950s. And I want to go through that history before coming to the present, because I think also the way we interpret that history needs to be more problematized than is the case in much of the discourse. The ANC history is a long and complex one, preceded by decades of resistance to conquest, where many people concluded, and it was voiced by Pixley Kaisaka Seme, that one of the reasons for the creation of the Union of South Africa, the defeat of African people, was their being divided. And one of the key reasons for forming the ANC, or as it was then called, the South African Native National Congress, was the need to have a unified resistance and not have divisions between different chieftains or tribes. In the course of engaging in this history, many people ridiculed the early ANC because of the way they appeared to imitate the British rulers, the discourse of loyalism that they used. And this was primarily a professional stratum, although chiefs were involved in the forming of the ANC. There were not trade unions involved in it and so forth. This professional stratum engaged in a discourse of loyalism and a particular way of dressing themselves, of dress And I've tried in this paper to argue that they used that within the limitations of the numbers that the ANC comprised at the time, they used that discourse of loyalty as a way of advancing their positions. I took a quote from John Berger, the famous progressive art critic, where he says, "The suit as we know it today developed in Europe as a professional ruling class costume in the last third of the 19th century. Almost anonymous as a uniform, it was the first ruling class costume to idealize purely sedentary power, the power of the administrator and the conference table. Essentially, the suit was made for the gestures of talking and calculating abstractly." And I argue that there was, in the imitation of the ruling class uniform of the British, the pocket watches, the dress suits and all these things, there was an ironical and even subversive element in this expression of loyalty to the crown, which in some of the discourse throws doubt on the allegiance owed to the Union government. In the discourse used by the early ANC in addressing the crown, they often say that they have always been loyal to the British royalty, and they have never accepted that the Union government is in place of the crown. And in some ways, there's something subversive about that, because it is pitting, it's playing a sort of divide and rule in reverse, in pitting the British kingdom against the Union government. But loyalism did set limits on African political activity, because shortly after the formation of the ANC, there was this famous women's demonstration in the Free State, 1913, against the pass laws. But all these campaigns were halted, and there was a land deputation going to Britain at the time. All of these deputations were halted when there was a declaration of war in World War I, and immediately the ANC dropped their grievances and went to Pretoria to offer Congress's services to the South African government in the war effort as part of the Commonwealth. I don't even remember if it's called the Commonwealth then. But the government did not want Africans as combatants. Nevertheless, over 80,000 Africans served as non-combatants. Now, the ANC as an organization met only once a year in conference in its early period, and the links between the branches, provinces, and so on were loose. However, when you look at the work of Peter Lim, ANC, the early years, you will see that there's quite a disjuncture between the formal character of the ANC and what was happening on the ground. For example, non-Africans were legally not members of the ANC. De facto, non-Africans were members, especially in the Western Cape. Women were not members formally admitted to ANC membership until 1943. De facto, they were members in many cases. Freni Ginwala showed this in 1990, but Peter Lim quotes Vredenburg in the Northern Cape, where 7 out of 37 members of the branch were women. Even if there was this disjuncture between the formal, purely African character of the African male character of the ANC and what was happening on the ground, and also Peter Lim often shows that there were more activities than were credited for the ANC of that time. Nevertheless, the politics of petitioning, which the ANC engaged in at that time, petitioning the Crown, sending delegations to the Crown, this led to the ANC being outflanked. And I think this is a very important history, part of the history of resistance, that the ANC was not a mass organization in the main until the 1950s, and it was outflanked in the early period by the Garveyites and the ICU, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, who both relied in varying degrees on a call referring to the imminent arrival of Americans to set South Africans free. Were situations where planes landed somewhere in the Eastern Cape, and some of the chiefs ran for their lives because people really were, the message of the Garveyites, and to some extent the same message was conveyed by the ICU, who Helen Bradford, leading historian of the ICU, argues that the ICU was in reality a nationalist movement. Nevertheless, it is untrue to suggest that there were not mass activities at all in this period. In 1919, for example, there was an anti-pass campaign where people dumped all their passes in Johannesburg as an act of defiance. That was the Johannesburg branch of the Transvaal Native Congress. But that defiance coexisted with loyalism. Protesters sang Nkosi Sikelel' Africa, God Save the King, and Rule Britannia. The Transvaal ANC issued a pamphlet supporting their demands, displaying the Union Jack, as the women did, by the way, in 1913 in Bloemfontein, and declaring at this pass defiance, we are loyal. Now, this mix of symbols was not unique. As I say, the women did it in Bloemfontein even earlier. But if you look at the words of Rule Britannia, it's interesting to see how this can be used as a claim. The ANC of the time, or SANNC of the time, was by asserting loyalty as British subjects, making a claim. Rule Britannia has these words: Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never shall be slaves. The nations not so blessed as thee must in their turn to tyrants fall. So by asserting their loyalty to the British, by singing Rule Britannia and claiming British citizenship and rejection of discrimination, they were saying they were part of a nation, the British nation, which was not like those who fell under tyrants. This went along with commitments to notions of universalism as they interpreted their allegiance, as they interpreted their Christianity, and the liberalism of the early Cape. And this had a lasting effect in setting the ANC on a trajectory that remained opposed to exclusivist and chauvinist forms of Africanism or domination by any particular ethnic group. Even though both African exclusivism and chauvinism repeatedly resurfaced, they were contrary to its overall ideological ethos. And when the Marxist influence came to be felt within the ANC, it converged with liberalism and Christianity in espousing universalism. It's also found in a number of ANC human rights documents, which started in the 1920s, in fact. But by the end, whatever the validity of this rereading that I'm trying to present of the period of loyalism, it ran its course. By the end of the 1930s, there had been the radical presidency of J.T. Gumede, who visited the USSR, where he said he'd seen the new Jerusalem chiefs as hereditary leaders and parts of the ANC raised their own fears, saying, the Tsar of Russia was a great man in his country, but where is he now? Gumede was voted out and replaced by Seme, who by then had become a lot more conservative in the context of the 1930s, and he warned of the dangers of radicalism. Seme, as president, condemned strikes and any causing of trouble for the authorities. The ANC, said, must condemn the spirit of sedition in every form. Such statements discouraged labor radicals from associating with the ANC. The period of the ANC's decline was also a period where it couldn't appeal to the rising labor movement, and it basically became moribund. On saying that, I want to suggest, however, that when we say that an organization has become moribund, we need to be aware that that may be true at the center, but we don't always know what is happening in villages, which fall outside the radar screen of what is being reported. In the late 1930s, and especially in the 1940s, efforts were made to rebuild the organization. Incidentally, one of the ANC committees, one of the committees formed to revive the ANC, sent a delegate to meet Gandhi in India and get advice on what to do there. And I think this is quite important to consider in the context of the evolution of Gandhi's consciousness in relation to Africans in South Africa, that they were convinced that Gandhi was supportive, as he was at the time of the formation of the ANC. Now, from the late 1930s, especially with the election of Dr. Xuma to the presidency of the ANC, together with Canon Talata, the ANC started to revive and to build organization. Previously, the ANC was sporadic in its emphasis on building organization. This was also the time of the development of the ANC Youth League, advancing militant ideas that would transform the ANC and its policies in the 1950s. The ANC Youth League, through Lembede, advanced a relatively exclusivist Africanism, hostile to cooperation with other communities and with communists. Xuma was, however, pragmatic, and he initiated cooperation with the communists, agreeing on the need to build organization. The relationship between the communists and the ANC had been one that was ambiguous from both sides. On the side of the ANC, there was suspicion of this doctrine that was often depicted as foreign, but on the side of the communists, there was a contempt for the ANC, which it saw as a petty bourgeois organization. But in the 1930s, the Communist Party accepted the need to address the oppression of Black people and adopted the notion of an independent native republic, a conservative part of, a controversial doctrine, but nevertheless a doctrine that made it possible for the streams of class struggle and national struggle to be joined organizationally in the ANC and the Communist Party from then onwards. And a situation where shared goals and strategies of the two organizations increasingly emerged. With the ANC Youth League becoming a key force in the ANC, Walter Sisulu was elected Secretary General of the ANC, and the ANC for the first time in the 1950s became a mass organization, and this may be the only period in the ANC's history until possibly the 1980s, 1990s, when the ANC became the hegemonic African nationalist organization in South Africa. But what is significant also is it was a mass organization in that period, engaging in a defiance campaign where 8,000 people were in prison, 100,000, the membership of the ANC rose to 100,000. This campaign, incidentally, was heavily influenced by the powerful Indian Congress resistance, which had seen 2,000 people jailed in the 1940s and was in fact inspired by earlier campaigns of Gandhi, such as the 1908-1909 burning of Indian identity documents. This period also saw the rise of Luthuli as a leader who was significant for a number of different reasons. As a result of his participation in defiance, Pretoria demanded that he choose between the chieftaincy, he was in fact an elected chief, and ANC politics. He refused and was deposed, issuing the famous statement, "The road to freedom is via the cross." What's also significant about Luthuli, which I mentioned in my third talk, I think it was that he became president of the ANC, the Natal ANC, just after the conflict between Indians and Africans in 1949. And his cooperation with the leaders of the Indian Congresses was a very important factor in building unity across communities. This period of the 1950s was also the period of the Congress of the People, leading to the creation of the Freedom Charter. Before Z.K. Matthews proposed this in Cradock in 1953, he had been in the United States, and there's some historical evidence to the effect that the famous singer Paul Robeson was involved in discussions with Z.K. Matthews, which were part of the reasons. I don't have full documentation of this, but you can read, if you go and check on Paul Robeson in South Africa, you will see that there are some suggestions that he was involved in the formulation of the idea. But the importance of the idea was that it involved the creation of the Freedom Charter was a campaign where people had to go and listen and elicit demands from workers, peasants, women in various types of other occupations, and people from all communities. This document, this gathering of demand was later formulated into a consensus and became the Freedom Charter. And its strength lay in being at once a statement of general freedoms found in most human rights documents internationally, but also one specifically South Africa. Now, this charter provoked the government and led to the Treason Trial, where 156 people were arrested and involved until 1961, the last 30, some of them charges were temporarily suspended, but the last 30 were acquitted in 1961. This was a period not only of mass nationalism, but multiracial activity involving the Congress, or the Indian Congresses, the Congress of Democrats, Colored People's Congress, the South African Congress of Trade Unions. United behind the idea of a South Africa without racism, the word non-racialism was only coming into discourse around the 1959 or so. I think it's first used by Luthuli, along with the idea of a common society, which he and Jack Simons were advancing. Much of this mass activity, although it was blunted to some extent by the Treason Trial, which led to the neglect of organization, but the Sharpeville massacre and the banning of the ANC and PAC led to a new phase of existence of the ANC, although it also was a situation of crisis for the apartheid regime, with the stock market collapsing, a whole lot of other things. But when the ANC, I leave aside the PAC because I'm not dealing with them, but when the ANC was banned, it went underground. But as with many phases of the organization's history, many of the habits of the earlier period were carried through to the new period. For example, I did some interviews with some people, and it appeared that people still kept minutes when it was underground, because it had taken them a long time to learn these qualities required to chair a meeting and conduct minutes, so that some of the processes of, it was very hard also to get people to stop wearing the uniforms of the ANC, so that it was not long before most of the public figures inside the country were arrested, and much of the activities of the ANC of that period were very limited after about 1965. Now, this period, however, between 1963, the Rivonia trial, and the 1976 Soweto uprising, was not a period of complete inactivity. Now, I will refer, I didn't mention it in the paper, I'll refer, for example, to Zeerust. I went up to do interviews with someone in an area called Dinokana, where they had a meeting just after the banning of the ANC and the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe, and they had a meeting which is known as the meeting under the tree. And this is a tree that has got some ritual significance, because when you touch any branch, you just touch it, it falls off. Anyway, they made a decision that all the young initiates would go and join MK. So you've got young people, you have young people who at the age of 14 joined MK, and was conceived by those people in that community as becoming part of the initiation process to manhood by joining MK. Those people came back, stayed in Tanzania. They're known as the Gorillas from that area. They stayed there and came back, many of them with Tanzanian wives, after 1990. Now, the ANC tried to set up MK, and a lot of efforts were made to initiate campaigns in Rhodesia, together with ZAPU. Generally, the ANC regards these as having been unsuccessful, although you'll see I quote General Ron Reed daily of the Selous Scouts, who says that at one point they met such strong military activity from the side of the ANC in ZAPU that they feared it would turn into a rout. Now, after the Wankie and Sepulelo campaigns, there was a lot of anger amongst some of the MK cadres, and a memorandum was drawn up complaining about the emphasis on diplomacy. And Chris Hani was actually sentenced to death at one stage, although it was not carried out. A conference was called in Morogoro, Tanzania, where a strategy and tactics document was drawn up. This is a period when I got involved. It was a period when it seemed that the ANC was completely absent inside the country. This is not true. There were still, people couldn't be visible because they were underground. However, there was not a physical presence of the ANC for most of this period inside the country. They developed a long-term plan for overthrowing the apartheid regime, and that gave some people hope, although it would take a long time. The absence of the ANC in the public sphere coincided with the emergence of the Black consciousness movement, very militant, articulate group of people who gave some hope to people at the time. They were very important, obviously, in the 1976 uprising, but when the rising was crushed, lots of people crossed the borders. Some of them had planned to go to PAC, but the PAC was not well equipped to absorb these people, and most of them went into the ANC, and they were angry. And many of them wanted to take up the gun and go and fight. And the overall emphasis was that people should finish their schooling, but that the ANC was not interested in a man or woman being behind a gun, but what understanding that person had. And they were not fighting whites, but they were fighting for freedom. Now, many of these people who were absorbed into the ANC and MK at the time came back in the late 1970s and attacked police stations. And at that point, the demoralization that had set in, a new hope was rekindled, because these were young people who were not supposed to have guns in their hands, yet they were attacking police stations. The Soweto Rising and the re-emergence of MK, albeit in a small way, also emboldened anti-apartheid forces within the country, civics, youth organizations, revitalized trade unions that had actually started before 1976. And this led to a new popular struggle and the rise of the UDF. Also, within the apartheid regime, the displacement of Forster by P.W. Botha led to a rethinking, whereby certain spaces were opened for trade unions, not with a view to them becoming massively militant, but trying to keep the lid on the conflict, to normalize the situation, as it would be said. In that period, there was also a change in the intelligence overview towards the resistance forces. Before then, they had been modeled on the CIA and Mossad type of activity, whereby you didn't just gather intelligence, you actually played a militaristic role attacking the opposition, so that they were very close to the police. When P.W. Botha made Neil Barnard head of intelligence, the orientation changed. They believed that the enemy that the apartheid regime faced was not in Moscow, but was the conditions that people faced there. And they wanted to try and win the hearts and minds of the people. when I was I was just being released from prison at that time, and normally when you had been released, if you had professional qualifications, many whites went out on exit permits, and we decided inside prison that the situation had changed, that I might not have been house arrested as had been the case before, because of this attempt at normalization. So a lot of us decided to stay inside then, people who would previously have left the country. Now, with the formation of the UDF, resistance became much more than people like P.W. Botha would have wanted, and a process of ungovernability and popular power, which I dealt with in the last seminar, arose. It's important to understand that we cannot exclude the role of Lusaka in these things. It's important to pay full tribute to the struggle on the ground. But without radio freedom, without the strategic direction provided by Lusaka, this interface between the external and the internal, it would not have been possible to develop some of the ideas. I mean, the idea of popular power came from Lusaka, but people on the ground had to make it work. So I think it's important that we don't, in celebrating what was done inside the country, exclude the importance of what strategic direction was given, with lots of people listening nightly to Radio Freedom. In the same period, people like Mandela, as well as some in exile, concluded that they were in a stalemate, and they wanted to see if there was a possibility of exploring talks with a view to negotiating a settlement, because the people who were dying were not the whites or the military in the main, but they were mainly oppressed people of South Africa. And this led to the unbanning of the ANC and SACP and other banned organizations, release of Mandela and others. This happened very fast, and there was not, in my view, adequate consultation. Maybe it is not possible to conduct consultations in this situation when you want to have secret talks. But it led to quite a lot of suspicion and unhappiness, especially when in the early talks, the ANC made concessions like unilaterally suspending armed action. In the years that followed, the ANC had to rebuild as an organization which couldn't just pick up from 1960. It was hundreds of thousands of people who came to join with different levels of political understanding, conducting meetings in numbers of languages, and it was a very complex task of rebuilding the organization. But the ANC nevertheless had enormous prestige amongst the people of South Africa, and that is why it swept to being the leading force in government, ultimately the sole force in government in the period since then. Now, what we've seen in the years since 1994, I describe as hegemony and squandering of that hegemony. And this is not purely subjective. It is also a process where popular nationalism becomes state nationalism. The popular struggle that had made it necessary for the regime to meet with the ANC got transformed into state power, and that state power was one where people complained about service delivery, and that conception is one where self-empowerment was no longer a huge factor within the ANC thinking, and as we can see, it's not very much a factor today. One error I've got here is I say that Mandela thought it was impractical to choose his cabinet. What left out there was that the RDP conference had said that the NEC of the ANC should determine the cabinet, but Mandela said that is not practical. In the period that has followed since then, we have seen a descent of the ANCs into widespread corruption, violence, internal and external violence against the people of South Africa, but also internal violence relating to contestation for positions, because positions related to acquisition of wealth, or even at the level of the lowest level, a way of survival if one became a councillor. Some people like Carl von Holt argue that the violence is integral to the type of democracy that is being built in South Africa. This has not been countered by any espousal of the value of non-violence as a principle and peace as a value. We are living in a time when the ANC, which once used to be an organization with considerable debate, has become one where there's widespread depoliticization, despite massive inequality and hunger. This was especially the case in the period of Zuma's presidency, and Cyril Ramaphosa's election was one that was met with considerable goodwill. However, it has not been possible for the Ramaphosa-led government to give the type of leadership that is adequate to meet the longings of people for their basic needs to be met, exacerbated, of course, by the lockdown. But we've got a situation where the divisions within the ANC appear to have paralyzed the capacity of the new leadership to win support for new bold initiatives. We've seen the last week where SAA is to be bailed out, and there may be a case for doing that. However, the reallocation of resources to bail out SAA basically affect the poor and the needy, and dramatically things like basic education, money is needed to eliminate pit toilets and other things like that. So although I spent most of my time on the history, I want to suggest that the ANC is an organization, despite the ambivalent ambiguities of that history, the long time it took to reach hegemony, that hegemony has been squandered. And I think we have a situation of what I call choiceless democracy, where in fact there are not alternatives to the ANC that are present at the moment. And we need to think about politics outside of electoral politics as a way of recovering the desire of all people to have a leadership that can take them towards a truly transformed and emancipated society. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Prof. Satna. I'm reminded of the poem by Mkai Singama Pritani. So the ANC's shift from that, and Mkai was a kind of a militant, but you know, to say Singama Pritani, as you have kind of explained from your perspective, was actually part of demanding a universalism and then that transforming later into the mass defiance campaigns, Gandhiist influences, and then the guerrilla sort of transforming themselves into guerrillas, and then from guerrillas into sort of in exile, and then somehow the ANC then being able to build its base both in exile internally, building popular movements with the rise of the UDF, and that then transforming because of the stalemate. But because of all these years of building this hegemony, the ANC is able to win beautifully the elections and take state power. But since then, as you say, we've seen a squandering of that hegemony rather than a good use of it to fulfill the liberation mandate. Well, that's my view. Asemahle, it's over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Prof, for the great presentation. I would love to greet everyone that is here. I think we've been awake for a very long time, since 5 a.m. because we've been checking up on the election. So it feels very late, even though it's only around 11. I think the most important quote that I actually was able to garner from the conversation, because to be honest, I don't want it to be a presentation, but a conversation between different kinds of people. To be honest, these opportunities are very scarce, whereby people that have actually lived through the times and experience the rubber bullets, the prison, the environment during apartheid, having conversations with people that are actually were born after 1994, because it's actually much more gainful than actually going through the books at the library at South Campus, because you can actually ask questions in real time. So I think the most important part was that the ANC was never hegemonic until the 1950s. Because if you look at the history of the ANC, it starts, I don't want to dwell much on the history, because I think Prof has done a great job in terms of actually telling us about the history of the ANC, from the frontier wars, how people were actually able to unite themselves, and how the ANC was actually built by people that came from, that were influenced by America, that were influenced by Britain, because Pikli Sakaseme, I think firstly went to Columbia University, and then ultimately he went to Oxford. As much as there are still discussions whether he graduated at Oxford or not, but he actually was in that environment whereby he was influenced by other Africanist thinkers. But I think what is important about the generation of Sam, and also the generation that actually formed the ANC Youth League, is that all these guys actually came through missionary schools. They were product of missionary schools, all of them. So the influence of Britain and the influence of the Dutch is embedded in their way of thinking. And ultimately, if you look at their orientation and how they were able to actually bow down to the Queen even in the 1910s, it speaks a lot in terms of that history. But I think another important part that we actually must look at is the Union of South Africa, the formation of the Union of South Africa, whereby the Transvaal, the Cape Province, the Natal and Orange Free State were amalgamated to a country called the Union of South Africa. Because, for example, in the Cape at the time, there was limited, I can say, universal suffrage, because, for example, a guy like W.B. Khubusana, Zenkin Komo Magwalandi in 1906, was actually a parliamentarian in the Cape Province. So, he actually was part of the group that actually formed the ANC in 1912. And also, I also would like to link the formation of the ANC in 1912 to the frontier wars, because if you look at the frontier wars, it was actually royalty that was leading those wars. Maqoma was royalty, Golomba and Sanila was royalty, and also the formation of the ANC it actually was heralded by the royals, because the ANC was supposed to be formed in 1911. because in December 1911, just because the kings at the time had to go around their own communities and actually and fundraise money for the ANC to actually sit a conference. Ultimately, the conference set in January 1912. So I think, and also if you look at in 1927, when Gumede went to the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, it was actually the royalty, because of the Tsars that were actually now deposed, that actually said no, Gumede must actually step down and to be replaced by Pitli Sakaseme. Pitli Sakaseme that nearly destroyed the ANC at the time, because during his role, the Pitli Sakaseme of 1912 that formed the ANC was very different to the Pitli Sakaseme that actually became president of the ANC. Because firstly, he had aged, and secondly, he saw himself as an elite, because at the time, the ANC was an elite organization, which actually had relevance in circles of people that were educated at the time, and not grassroots individuals that are actually residing in villages and townships. And in villages and townships. So there was that disconnect in terms of the ANC and the people, and that's what actually ultimately nearly ended the ANC in 1912. The crisis that we actually faced during the Zuma years was quite, I think, was quite less compared to the impact that Pitli Sama had in terms of actually nearly collapsing the ANC. So I think, as well, another very important point is that the 1920s, the student movement in the 1920s was on the rise. The labor unions at the time were on the rise, whether they are white or were black unions, but the trade union movement was on the rise. And the ANC did not have any connections with the student movement, did not have any connections with the labor movement. And so that adversely affected them in terms of actually being able to mobilize a large number of people. So their membership of the ANC, I think between 1912 and 1950, it was quite very small. So it was just an elite environment of people that were actually well educated. So I think that's when this class of the 1940s become very relevant and very important, because as much as they also came from an elite background, because if you look at the class of the Youth League in the 1940s, that actually formed the Youth League in 1944, Anton Lambert had a BA, he had a master's, and then he had a LLB degree. At the time, he was well educated. Nelson Mandela at the time was royalty, chamber royalty, and he was well educated, went to Forte. So as much as these guys actually were elite as well in their own orientation, but the environment which they found themselves in was that they had to actually go to the masses. They had to actually mobilize large numbers, because if you look at the 40s, there's a very significant event in the 40s called the Alexandra bus boycott. It's very significant in the revival of the ANC. The bus boycott is very important. And also, if you look at the formation of the 1937 formation of Orlando Pirates, whereby Sofasonke Mpanza actually took people from Johannesburg, CBD, and actually settled in now what is called Soweto. So there were those movements which were happening. So the people were actually mobilizing themselves outside of the ANC. So the ANC had no choice but to actually align themselves with these groups of people that were actually mobilizing themselves in large numbers. So I think that's when I don't want to say feud, but the disagreement between Dr. A.B. Kuma and who was regarded as and his class of gentlemen with clean hands, and the ANC Youth League, which was inspired by Africanist thinkers and mass mobilization movements around the world. I think that's when this thing came from, because I think A.B. Kluma represented the old generation of the ANC. And then these guys were actually now coming in with new ideas that were actually very unsettling to the old establishment. So there was this battle. And the significance of that battle is very important, because I think if we look at the life, I don't want to go through all the events because of time, but if you look at the life of the ANC, they're going to see that the significance of the youth in 1944 saved the ANC. And ultimately, if you look at the 1969 Morogoro Conference, which was, to be honest, as much as we know that Treason was nearly executed because of that memorandum, but the youth played a massive role, because his detachment, as you all know, his detachment nearly was the first detachment of MK to actually try to actually get inside the border, and then they were stopped in Zimbabwe, as we all know that history. So I'm saying that the ANC, African National Congress, is renewal over the years, and its gaining of hegemony was always, in terms of the locomotive of that, were always young people that were very militant in their nature, that actually went against the establishment. Even the likes of Nelson Mandela, when they were imprisoned, I recently went through Long Walk to Freedom, because I wanted to see the impact of the 1976 generation in Robben Island when they came from the townships. And the impact that they had was that which was very positive, because, to be honest, I don't want to say they had settled, the likes of Nelson Mandela had settled in Robben Island, but now they were actually, they had accepted the situation and the environment that they were in. And then came the likes of Terra Likota, came the likes of Mike Klego, and then unsettled these old generations, which, as much as they were disrespectful to the high organ of the ANC at the time, because they did not recognize their credentials, because for the longest time, the ANC in the 70s had been very silent, and the 60s had been very silent, because even the Morogoro Conference was not internal. That's significant as well. There were no conferences that said internal. The last conference that said of the ANC was, I think, in 1958, before the 1991 conference that set in Durban, if I'm not mistaken. So the ANC had no visibility. So these guys, as much as they maybe they knew the history of the ANC, but they could not relate to this old man in Robben Island. So they were able to actually revive, and there are a lot of gains that were made during that period in Robben Island. And also, if you look at the 1980s, the formation of the UDF, which I think Prof. Sadner was very active in terms of during that era, and also in terms of the literature. There's a book that he wrote with Jeremy Cronin on the Freedom Charter, on the Freedom Charter, which actually was very popular during the 80s, and it actually was able to actually inspire a lot of young people in the 80s. So the locomotive of the ANC has always been young people that had militant ideas. And also, if you look at the 70s, I think as well, the 1976 generation played a big role, because it actually led to the total strategy of the apartheid regime, whereby that apartheid regime had to actually employ tactics that actually exposed them to the world, because now they could see that the country was actually getting out of control. The measures that they put place in terms of the old petty apartheid laws, now they were becoming irrelevant in terms of actually stopping the revolution. So they had to employ a total strategy, and they had to, I recently studied the budgets of the apartheid regime. During the PW board, before he became the state president, he was the Minister of Defense. And during this period, the GDP the budget that was allocated to the defense ministry, I think, rose exponentially. I think it more than doubled, because now they had to actually employ tactics that were actually different. And also, I think there's another aspect the Prof did not touch on is the external mission of the ANC, whereby there was the border war which was happening in the frontline states, and also the context of the Cold War as well was very important in terms of the ANC history and in terms of our liberation. Because if we look at a very significant period of the ANC called the Battle of Côte Carnaval, which actually led us to actually negotiate with the apartheid regime, and led us to actually led to the declaration, which was Harare Declaration, which was I think co-authored by O.R. Tambo, where he had a stroke at the time, and there was a lecture which was delivered by Judge Albi Sachs recently, and he said that if the stroke happened before he wrote the Harare Declaration, then it was going to be hard for the ANC to actually enter into the negotiation period. And also, I think as well, if you look at the 80s as well, I think it's a very significant period, because
just to ask you to start wrapping up, Asamahle. So it's time for questions, yeah? So okay. Just alerting you.
Okay, no, I'm just trying to move quickly. And also the 80s are very significant because of the loss of revenue in terms of the apartheid regime was losing a lot of revenue. Therefore, companies such as Anglo-American started to play a massive role in terms of actually shifting the dynamics. And it reminds me of the 1800s as well, because the politics of mining have always been at the center. The mineral energy complex had always been a driving force of the South African economy. But I think I'll be able to actually discuss other things during the Q&A. Hopefully, I'll be able to get questions and be able to speak on the things that I might have left. Thanks, Prof.
Thanks. So I'm going to open up for questions. Just take note, I'm going to ask you both this question, which is, so Asamahle, you pointed out that the youth have been key, but all that youth had been socialized into the ANC through the struggle. But of course, I was hoping you were going to touch on the current crisis of the ANC Youth League, which is really a bunch of young people, many of whom were not born into the struggle. And so I wonder if that's what's making a difference in the ANC. In fact, I would argue that the older generation has more of a sense of how the ANC operates because they were inculcated into the ANC of the struggle, whereas perhaps the younger people who are born into a different context have maybe a different sense of how to fight their battles in the ANC because they were born outside of the struggle. So they, A, don't have legitimacy, but B, may not may not actually know how to wrangle power from the prior generation, because that prior generation has a different socialization. And so that's why the ANC Youth League had to form outside as the EFF, the totally new system. So I don't know if people have some questions around that. Just take note of that, because I think that's quite important. Okay, so I usually have a problem with seeing hands. So if you want to pose a question or make a comment, you don't have to pose a question. You can just make a comment if you wish. And if I don't see your hand, you can let me know in the chat there. The other thing, Asamahle, that you touched on were these other external forces that shaped the ANC. You spoke about the economy, the minerals, energy complex, Anglo-American and others. And I thought, Raymond, you didn't touch on how the questions of the economy have shaped the ANC into the present. And that's a bit of an omission from a communist. You should have said something about how the structural conditions of democracy have impacted on the ANC. It's one thing to say that they've fallen into corruption, but what were the contexts in which the ANC has had to transform from a mass popular movement? You spoke about service delivery, loss of agency, but what agency was there at the point of transition, and so on? So I think you jumped over those things unnecessarily for someone who has been part of the battles around the economic issues. So if there's no questions, those are my two questions. Perhaps, Satna, we can go to you, just answer those two, and then I'll just wait and see if there's other questions, and then I'll allow Asemahle to comment.
Want me to answer your question or respond to Asemahle?
Both of them. Well, you can also respond to Asemahle's contribution.
On the economy, I was not involved in a lot of economic discussions in my background. And I do think that I haven't done justice to the economic constraints. And if I had gone into the present, what I would have said is at the time of the unbanning of the ANC, there was a completely new conjuncture in the world with the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union and its allies, so that the possibilities of investment and a lot of these other things created almost a sense of panic. When Mandela went on a visit overseas, he came back and was in a sense of not panic, but really anxiety about notions like nationalization and so forth. And I think that the early post-1994 decisions were made under considerable constraint, where the ANC could not count on a lot of the support bases that it previously had, and it had to negotiate a way outside of the constitutional things, a way of preventing massive withdrawal of capital. Whether they made too many concessions in that period is another matter. On Asemahle's input, I really do agree very much on the emphasis on the continuing influence, I think, of the missionaries, and I would add liberalism, because there's a tendency to just attack liberalism, but a lot of the universalism that is valuable in the present derives from a combination of Cape liberalism and the missionary influence. There's a lot of things, that were not adequately covered. I do think Asemahle is correct in emphasizing the decisive impact of the Cuita-Cuanavalle battle. For the first time, the SADF was sent running back home, although they declared that they had a victory. The level of agency that the ANC had in the economy is, I think, limited, because it viewed the transfer of power as an end in itself at the level of electoral power. It did not, it was not part of the negotiations to negotiate how the economy would be transformed, and it was not seen as a dynamic process from then onwards. But I'm not let me say, I don't have massive expertise in this. That may be also one of the reasons I didn't say more on that.
Asemahle?
Oh, sorry, Prof. What is the question again?
The question was about the youth, remember. So I said, you spoke a lot about the youth as a transformative agent within the ANC. And I'm asking if right now the ANC Youth League cannot play that role, partly because many of the ANC Youth League would have not been born in struggle. Even if they were, but they would have been young. So they were socialized outside of the old ANC that was a liberation movement. So the way they understand things and the way they fight things within the ANC is very different. And so so for example, if you look at people in the ANC, they kind of just have a consensus about non-racialism. It doesn't matter, up to Mbalula. They can be militant, they can say anything, kill everything, but they have a consensus about non-racialism. Whereas the Malema generation and thereafter does not have the same level of consensus on the meaning of non-racialism. And they have a slightly different conception of what it means to construct a non-racial society. So the new youth league and the so I'm asking around that. Why right now? What is the status of the ANC youth league?
Yeah, I think I get your question now, Prof. I think if you look at the 90s, I think the 90s are very significant. You look at the 90s and the formulation of the RDP and the whole Washington consensus, which was happening around the world in terms of the global dynamics, in terms of the economy, because now the Cold War had ended. Now there was only one superpower, which was the USA. So as much as we had all these great policies in the RDP, they're not implemented because of fear that the world was going to this direction. So now taking a leftist approach is now going to actually isolate the ANC in terms of international balance of forces. So ultimately, if you look at the 2012 Gallagher conference of the ANC Youth League, they actually went back to all those ideals of Mbuyiso Longweta. They went back to all those ideals of Treason, which formulated the RDP ultimately. So the youth, as much as there's no, they're not socialized during those times, but there's a linkage between generations of comrades in terms of ideology and in terms of culture within the ANC. For a simple example, they were still seeing here at university. As much as where some of me, for example, I was born in 1997, but I still sing about Lusaka, I still sing about Oliver Tambo. So the culture of the ANC it does not diminish because one was not born within a particular era. It's something which actually goes on and until the last line of cadence. That's why we still call ourselves comrades. That's why we still do the things that we do ultimately. So I'm saying that even the resolutions of the ANC in the 2017 NASREC conference, those were the resolutions which were taken by young people. But the problem that we have currently is that there's neo-patrimonial networks in the ANC that are so deep to a point whereby, for example, as we all know that there was a lot of money which was invested in the conference of the ANC by corporates. So the current incumbent leadership it's very hard for them to actually follow those resolutions that were taken by young people predominantly in 2012 in the ANC Youth League Gallagher conference, and 27. Those, if you look at those resolutions, they are the same. And if you look at the 1991 resolutions which were taken by the old generations of the ANC, those they are very similar to those precisely. So I'm saying that the linkage and the socialization does not change because maybe now we are being shot with rubber bullets in terms of instead of live ammunition. The culture will always be there, and the policies that we actually are being advocated by the ANC Youth League and currently are policies that were always advocated by the likes of Ani and them. And I'm not sure if it answers your question, but yeah, that's my contribution.
Okay, I don't know if there's other comments or questions. I'm not sure that we're still getting a full grappling with why the EFF had to go externally, but there's a comment there by Ellen. Ellen, do you want to switch on your mic?
Hi, yes. No, I was just wondering in terms of the history of the ANC, whether it's always been, kind of, depicted as an anti-apartheid organization, but yet you had the involvement of the communists and the Communist Party and trade, trade unionists. And were they ever venturing on the imperialist path? I mean, also with our colleagues here watching what's happening, the USA, and it's now what? It's neither fish nor fowl, so to speak, in terms of who's going to who's going to come out, out tops there. But I'm just asking that question because very early on in the new government of the ANC, they ditched the RDP. They had Jay Naidu as the minister there at some stage, and then it was ditched. And in terms of the economic path that we've been on since in 1994, and where we are ending up now, going cap in hand to the IMF and to the World Bank. In terms of your reading of the history, was there ever an impulse, a strong one, not to go that that neo sort of the liberal sort of route? Yeah, thanks.
I think if I can add on to that question, was the ANC ever, how did the ANC lose its focus on was it ever ready to govern economically? That's actually that's the question I actually want to ask. Because when you see now, was the ANC ever really ready to govern economically? Because I'm looking at if you look at the issue of, for example, just ANC trying to integrate itself back into the country. We've heard, I don't know if they're true, but stories of Mandela having to receive suitcases from Gaddafi, financial support, that kind of thing. I mean, is any liberation movement ever ready to govern economically?
Okay. Can I answer that one, Prof?
Sure.
I think if we look at the history of the ANC, especially from its inception, the first time that they had actually an economic department, it was in the late 80s. And ultimately in the 90s, there was something called the Microeconomic Group, which was led by predominantly the Communist Party. And in terms of the ideas of if you look at the formulation of the RDP mainly, there's still a large debate within the circles of the ANC, whether was it a document of the ANC or was it a document of COSAD, because I think COSAD played a massive role in the formulation of the RDP, especially the NUMSA class. I think that's why ultimately, if we look at once the RDP was ditched, the trade union movement called the incumbent leadership that was actually taking care of the economy at the time, the 1996 class project, because it was the conception of theirs. So I don't think liberation movements, in terms of how they operate, are ready to govern economically, because in their structure and how they operate underground and they operate illegally. So they operate not within the prescripts of the law, most of them. So even how they mobilize money, how they spend money. For example, there's a story which is actually, I think it's documented in the 1969, 1968 Hani memoranda, whereby Chris Hani and his cohort of friends, they were complaining that the businesses of the ANC, in terms of how they are being run, they're actually being run in a manner whereby people actually enriching themselves. So the corruption element in the ANC was always there. But at the time, it was not out in the open, because that's how the ANC operated. It was able to, it mobilized money in that way. So I think it was not ready by the mere fact that the economic department way late in the 80s, late 80s.
Can I say something on this? When Alan asked about an anti-imperialist element, if you look at the 1969 Morogoro strategy and tactics, there's a commitment to socialism. And in 1979, there's a secret document called the Green Book, which was on the ANC website at one stage, where Oliver Tambo is there with a lot of others, some communists, some not communists, and they say, we are committed to socialism, but basically we can't articulate that in the foreground because of the broad range of people whom we are trying to mobilize internationally behind the ANC. But it's important to understand that the version of socialism that gained support within the ANC was the Soviet version of socialism. And the Communist Party had a lot of prestige in the period of exile, and a lot of those people who were communists no longer were communists after 1990. So that's something to ask, why is it that people dropped their commitment to communism and to socialism? The third point I want to raise is there were some things, not just negotiations, that just happened. I was in the leadership of the ANC, and gear was adopted without consultation with the ANC. It was announced as being state policy as well as ANC policy and non-negotiable. So a lot of things happened in the process of the ANC becoming government that would not easily have happened in the consultative processes that I think were part of the pre-1993 period. Whether the ANC was ready to govern or any liberation movement is ready to govern, my answer would be some people were ready to govern, some in the sense that they foresaw how it was going to unfold. I remember some people were going for a civil service course in Britain, and I looked at this and I had some contempt for it. But these people understood better than someone like myself how things were going to unfold. And the truth of the matter is that some people in the ANC foresaw how things were going to develop better than others, and socialism didn't have any part in that. So it's like, sounds a bit conspiratorial, but that's how I have experienced it, that suddenly what were shared understandings were no more, because some people understood that this had to be run, I think correctly in some ways, had to be run much like a conventional state bureaucracy.
Okay, so we've kind of reached the end. I think you guys have left us with more questions than insights in some sense, because I think the economic question, not just as a structural question for South Africa, but for how you transform liberation movements thereafter. I think one of the struggles the ANC has is that everyone is ANC. Everyone is ANC. Everyone, you know, and MK is not just those who are outside. So how do you reintegrate your society out of armed struggle, out of mass popular protest and internal struggle to try and integrate them into an economy and convert people who were fighting a regime into economically productive citizens under the kind of economic conditions that the ANC has faced? And I just want to conclude by saying, you know, we had a conversation with Mazibuko Jaha the other day within our history class, and, you know, the issue that we were trying to unpack is how can you really deal with an economic crisis such as that was apartheid under neoliberal conditions? I mean, that's the constant question. And what does that mean? So trying to and whether or not, in fact, the ultimate question that I ask is, were Black people really ready to take on a capitalist economy? No, we were not. Because that can, and when we look at how BEE was an idea of the apartheid regime itself, or let's say people within the apartheid regime, when white business invented BEE, another point that Mazibuko has been making, white business invented BEE, but BEE has been part of the crisis now. So we have all these questions to ask about how liberation movements manage themselves and their economies. And I think and that's why I think in many ways the ANC has been unable to deal with the youth question, because that's exactly the question that the youth put on the table. And they don't put it on the table on charterist terms. They put the economic question on the table on Africanist terms. And it may be a narrow Africanism, but it's a question that the ANC cannot answer within its own framework of the Freedom Charter. Because effectively the youth today are saying, no, South Africa does not belong to all who live in it. That's not what we see. And so I think that is a question, but the issue really becomes, what is from the point of view of Black South Africans, were we ever ready for this capitalism as it has been brought onto us? And I think that is how the ANC post-apartheid, the ANC in government, that is what has shaped the ANC in government in many ways. So I would like to thank everybody. Oh, Pomelo, sorry, always I miss names. Pomelo has a hand up. We'll take Pomelo quickly, and then I can Pomelo's surname, but we'll give you the last, Pomelo Ra, I will give you the last word here. Ratladi.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Am I heard by everybody?
Yes, we can hear you, yeah. You can put on your video, I think, as well.
Can I please stay mute on the video?
Yeah.
Okay. Ma'am, in addition to your question, or rather statement, as to the youth league's idea on the governing of the ANC currently, like I would wanna like raise a question on that would you rather say, because now Prof. Satna mentioned that the PAC were not well equipped as an organization, and yet the ANC were funded by the British colony. So would you say that the reason to why the Soweto uprising and as well as the Rivonia trial were like incomplete activisms because of the fact that they were led by the PAC, and the PAC were like anti-white movements? So would you say that is the reason to why those activisms and the PAC did not like become able to like rule and become in government, as to leading the Black community to consciousness and everything, because of the fact that they were against white liberals at the time, and saying that they were more into the communist ideologies of everything, but rather like, and the reason to why the NP were willing to negotiate eventually was because they saw that most of due to Mandela being in prison and most of the leaders being in prison, they saw that it was better to side with the enemy of the ruling party and to go against their current ideologies of how they are willing to grow the state in their idea. So would you say that that is the reason why the PAC did not succeed as an organization?
Okay, so I'll just ask Raymond and Asamatle quickly to respond to that. I guess the question is really the PAC, its trajectory kind of broke from some of the ways that the ANC operated. And so does that actually set a destiny for the ANC?
I don't think that the PAC failed because of its ideology. It was in existence for a very short time before it was banned, and was not able to survive in exile as easily as the ANC. There was a lot of infighting, all sorts of things like that. So I don't think it's for ideological reasons. It's not correct to say the British funded the ANC in that period. I don't think it's because the PAC had its ideology. I just think it didn't have the organizational capacity to survive after that. And I think it's a mistake to write off Africanism as an ideology, but Africanism has never found an adequate organizational form that endures. That is the problem. There are probably a lot of Africanists in South Africa today, but they don't have an organizational thing. Just before I finish, I just want to say, because I'm not going to get it wrong, I want to thank NMU for hosting me. I'd like to thank Kenrad and History and Politics, particularly, and the chair of critical thought, the DVC, for giving me this opportunity to present in these occasions. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks. We appreciate you, Raymond. So what you're saying to Pumelo is that, in fact, the trouble was the PAC as an organization was too young to survive the onslaught, whereas the ANC had already had quite a long history of being of existence. So it was much better able to resist the state. Okay, that's interesting. Gwala?
I think I was going to answer this more or less the same way that the prof answered, so I don't want to make it lengthy.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you. Is there anyone else? Have race relations improved? Okay, I don't know if there's a question there. Have race relations improved or regressed in SA since 1994? I never know what people mean by race relations. I think we need to reformulate that concept. What are race relations? What are those? If you were in my class, Gundo Vusani, I'd be asking you, what are race relations? Because under apartheid, we were being oppressed. Today, we are trying to build democracy. So what are race relations? Do white people and black people like each other? What do you mean? You know, black people have always liked everybody, and there've been lots of white people who equally like, you know, and so I never know what race relations refers to. So in a future seminar, you're going to have to refine your question to a much more precise concept than the one of race relations. Thank you, everybody. Go back and check your election obsession there. Nomalanga has twice predicted that Trump is gonna win. So let's see if I am right again. And then you can call me afterwards. Even if he doesn't win, the liberals are losing badly in terms of moral authority. So let's talk about that in another seminar. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Raymond, and
thank you, Raymond. Thanks, Asemahle.
Asemahle. Thank you so much for holding the series for us.